Thank you so much for coming. My name is Paul Roth. I'm the director of the Image Center here at Toronto Metropolitan University. And it is my pleasure to welcome all of you for this lecture talk about our exhibition with Ben Shneiderman. This event is held in conjunction with our current exhibition, Chim's Children of Europe, which is on view at the Image Center until April 4th. I hope you've all had a chance to see it, but if you have not, you will certainly want to after tonight's lecture. TMU, where we're gathered tonight, is located on the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe, Mississaugas, and Haudenosaunee peoples. We embrace the responsibility that we've inherited from generations that came before to care for the land and also the many people who make their homes here. I want to take a moment as we're starting to thank the university for its steadfast support of our work, our exhibitions and programs like this. You know, there's so many people that are not here tonight that we work for at the university, and I can't tell you how supportive they are. And every once in a while, I'm overcome with that feeling, and I want to acknowledge what they have done to make it possible for us to have events like this one. And I'd also like to extend our thanks to the Ontario Arts Council, which supports us with an operating grant annually, which supports our exhibitions, programs, and operations in general. The OAC supports the arts throughout Ontario, and we're very happy to be among their grantees. Before we get started, I'd like to mention a couple of housekeeping things that are important. First, as those of you know who have been to our programs, we are recording tonight's lecture. And the reason for that is so that we can post it on our YouTube channel afterward for those who aren't able to attend in person. And so after the discussion, Ben will be ready to take questions from you. It's very important that if you raise your hand and I call on you, that you wait for us to bring you a microphone. And that way, your question can be heard not only in the room, but also on the recording. So thank you for your patience. And I do encourage you, if you have a question, to please ask. And now let me tell you a little bit about Ben Shneiderman. Ben has a really fascinating background. This is not our usual bio that I'm going to read. First and most relevant to tonight's subject, Ben is the nephew of renowned photojournalist and co-founder of Magnum Photos, David Seymour, or Chim. Ben has spent a great deal of time over several decades stewarding and promoting his uncle's legacy and his photographs, reflecting a generational inheritance carrying on the work of his own mother. And he does a fantastic job at it, I have to say. Not every person who monitors the legacy of a family member and stands in for a relative does a good job. Ben does. I know that because I first worked with Ben on Chim almost 20 years ago now, which is quite wonderful. And also, at the risk of embarrassing him, the curator of that show is here tonight, Tom Beck, who came from Baltimore, Maryland, and introduced me both to Chim and to Ben. But interestingly, Ben is also something else. He is a pioneering computer scientist, a distinguished professor emeritus at the University of Maryland, specializing in human-computer interaction. At the University of Maryland in 1983, Ben founded the Human-Computer Interaction Lab, where he conducted far-reaching and influential research on information visualization, user interface design, and human-centered computing, as it was called back then. And Ben is widely recognized for developing foundational design principles that have shaped modern digital interfaces. And our experience, everybody in this room, their experience of computers, including direct manipulation interfaces and visual information seeking strategies. Whenever you click on a link, think of Ben Shneiderman. His work has influenced generations of designers, researchers, and technology leaders, always with an emphasis on usability, accessibility, and the social impact of technology. Ben is the author of numerous scholarly publications, including the landmark text, Designing the User Interface. And over his career, he's received multiple awards for his contributions to computer science and human-centered design. However, tonight, his subject is Chim. Ben will be speaking to us about Chim's life and career, with a special focus on the landmark photo essay that we have on view, Children of Europe. Created in the aftermath of World War II, this seminal project documented the lives of displaced children across Europe, bringing international attention to their persistent humanitarian needs. Drawing on historical and personal insights, Ben will illuminate the enduring significance of this body of work, and he will share insights on his uncle's legacy. We are so happy to be able to welcome Ben Shneiderman to the Image Center and to Toronto. Ben?
Great. Thank you, Paul. Thank you for that kind introduction. And thank you all for coming out tonight. It's wonderful to be here. I especially also acknowledge Tom Beck, whose presence really elevates this event of importance to me and to, I hope, to you too. So I am the nephew of David Seymour Chim. Chim was born in Warsaw. My mother was his older sister. And there were just the two of them. And Chim was killed in 1956 while photographing in Suez for Newsweek. So it's a tragedy in the family story. But my mother carried on telling the story, preserving and promoting his work for all the years, and I took over and began to help with all that. But it's been an important part of my life, so I'm very much shaped by this, and some people tell me that I begin to look more and more like my uncle in the sketch there that Carlo Levi did. So this is the story of his life. We'll start, the first half is about, you'll see the photos and some of the work, and then I'll try to give you an understanding of what the impact of his work. It's now, here we are, 70 years since he was killed, and so that's kind of a long time to reflect on. So this classic picture, Elliot Erwitt is, offers this and gave me permission to use this, but it's the one that's most commonly shown. And here you see the thoughtful, reflective owl, as some called him, the chess player, a reflective connoisseur, well-dressed, knowledgeable about wines and foods, well-traveled, and so on. So the story begins in 1911 in Warsaw, but it picks up as he goes off to Leipzig to study. My grandfather, Benjamin Shneiderman, that's how I came to the name, was a famous publisher in Warsaw, sent his son to Leipzig, where there was a special school of publishing, and he was to learn to take over the family business. He followed that for a while, adopting some of the Bauhaus culture of that time, and then came to Paris to pick up his studies at the Sorbonne, and he picked up his camera too. So the story really begins to accelerate in Paris in the 30s. You see here Chim with my mother, his sister, his older sister, walking in Paris, and there my father with my mother there, a favorite picture, which has now been widely circulated. My parents were journalists, so there's been a lot of scholarship lately about their work, and so that's another satisfaction for me. You can see the adoring look, my mother here posing for Chim, but Chim also trying to tell the story of his sister. And this picture on the left, you see on the lower right, is the only one I have that he signed. Okay? It wasn't customary for photographers to sign that, but this one is the one he did. So he came from Warsaw, so you see his press passes and travel passes, picked up camera and began to photograph the Front Populaire, the movements of the 30s in Paris. My parents came also. In 1933, they married and came to Paris to be journalists. And Chim was there working and was beginning to show his photographs. And Paris of the 30s was a vibrant place. It was the intellectual center of the world at that time. And so these photographs show the protest. That was the spirit of the time. On the right, you see the steel workers and the raised fist. And you have to adopt your visual literacy or understand the Front Populaire as opposed to the Nazi salute. So they offer a somewhat different, a very different story, but you have to come to understand that. And on the top right, Willie Ronas took almost the same picture from more or less the same spot, and both of those pictures of the protesters in the upper right, and on the bottom you see one of the gatherings of the protest movements of the 30s. It was natural then, by 1936, when the Spanish Civil War was beginning, that Chim, my mother, and my father went to Spain to cover this vital story of the time. And so here you see some of Chim's work as a war photographer. Here the pilots drinking wine before their flight, and on the upper right, in the midst of a battle with the soldiers running. So Chim could do that too, but he preferred to be on the lower right with the refugees and to show the human drama of war and the effect that it had on civilians. Maybe most famous from that time is the nursing mother. Okay? This remarkable picture just captures the story of anguish. And it gained notoriety because it was featured on the cover of a magazine with German bombs and Luftwaffe planes. But it was not a German bombing raid. It was a labor union rally. I'm not sure what caused her to look up to the sky, but there she was. Now, looking up skyward, nursing a baby, keep that image in your mind. It's going to come back to us later. And you'll see in a favorite way. However, this was the image that we had, but we did not have the negative. We did not have the negative until 2007, when the Mexican suitcase was recovered. So you may know that fabled story. We could do a whole talk about that. There's an hour-and-a-half movie about it. In 1938, Chim and Robert Capa packed up 5,000 of their negatives from their Paris studio and put them in a carton, in a suitcase, or in a couple of boxes, and gave it to, I think, the consulate, the Mexican consulate, who rode it on a bicycle somewhere and then got on a boat and went to Mexico, and it disappeared. Cornel Capa, the younger brother of Robert, who was director of the ICP in New York, worked for many years, put ads in newspapers and tried to find this. Nothing happened until it surfaced one day when the aunt of a documentary filmmaker, the aunt died and gave him this box of photos. And so then it became a story. There were 2 decades of negotiations that did not bring to fruition. There were those in Mexico who said this must remain in Mexico and not go to New York. But myself and Cornell prevailed in eventually making this arrangement. It came to New York, and when it did, it was the full front page of the Sunday Times arts section that told the story of these 5,000 negatives. And later, Cynthia Young heroically put together a book and an exhibit that showed these images. So when we got the photo, here's what we found. When we got the negative, it was a very different way. It was cropped to show the heroic individual on the left, but Chim was always the community, was always the social construct, and the people all around. So you get 2 different ways of interpreting the image, and so, depending on which one you favor, you can take your pick of the history that you want to tell. I find that dramatic, difference there between those stories. During the war, Chim was in the U.S. Army. He was one of the Ritchie boys who went to Fort Ritchie in Maryland and became 14,000 European-descended Americans who were taught intelligence techniques. And they were trained because they spoke the languages, they knew the culture, and they had various jobs. Chim wound up doing photo interpretation of aerial photographs during the war and was involved in the D-Day invasion preparations. So here he is as a master sergeant, and a postcard to his friend Lucy, ride into the future, and there he is driving. But after the war, he picked up his camera again, and Magnum Photos, 1947, Robert Capa with with Chim were key founders. Henri Cartier-Bresson was the third. George Roger, William Vandervert, maybe less known to you, but they were also part of the founding group. And a famous story of it, at the Museum of Modern Art in New York was the founding, but Chim wasn't there. None of them were there, but it became a legendary story. And I hope you know something about Magnum Photos. It remains key photojournalism community. It's grown from these original 5 to about 85 photographers and 65 staff, struggling these days under the challenges of internet photography and the changing needs of photography and the changing needs of media. That's another story. Now, Jaber, who spoke here in November, tells a wonderful story. Her book on the Decisive Network describes the first 20 years of Magnum. I found it a wonderful book that really told the history, but so skillfully placed it in the context of what was happening in the media. It was the golden age of photojournalism and photo magazines. And so that was the time that they were working, and it was before television. And, it was the way that people got their visual understanding. So Magnum was a leader in doing it. It had a humanistic orientation. And so it was natural that early on, Chim would get the invitation from UNESCO to photograph, as Paul mentioned, the 11 million orphans of war in 6 countries. He traveled for 6 weeks, 257 rolls of film and shot with 35 millimeter Leica and Rolleiflex. For a larger 6x6 format. If you look downstairs, you'll see some of the horizontal format, 35 millimeter, but you'll also see the square Rolleiflex, higher resolution, better image quality. You'll see that. Keep your eye open for that. The book was produced with these photos, and one of them, my favorites actually, is this happier story of children dancing in a circle. A theme, again, this community or people together, not only single individuals, but groups. And so this dancing in a circle, there are maybe 8 or 10 Chim photos of children dancing in a circle that I find a wonderful. That would be a nice little exhibit to do, just those set of photographs. Among the pictures he took are these endearing, some say overly sentimental picture on the left. The cynics, the modern cynics don't like this. It's too sentimental, was one critic's comment, of showing these children struggling with a girl on the right holding a doll that's barely more than a bit of cloth hung together. But I always liked this one, and this picture was featured at the Art Institute of Chicago in an early exhibit about the children of Europe. And these other pictures, this one of the boys, I find just remarkable how Chim managed to look at this, 30 boys looking at him. They're not smiling and posing. They're there. He's made a relationship. And what you should ask yourself in many of these pictures, what happened in the 30 seconds before the photo was taken? I can imagine that Chim stepped up, waved his Leica, showed his Leica, sort of looked for permission, announced that he was there, invited them to participate, they posed, he composed, and then took the picture. And to get, these 11-year-old boys all looking at him intently in this way is rather striking. The same for that younger girl on the left, and of course, most famously, Tereshka. This girl was asked to draw a picture of her house on the blackboard, and all she could imagine or arrange was the scrawl. That picture is downstairs. It's highlighted in the UNESCO Courier magazine's story there, but you can see all of that there. It's a troubling picture, and again, it speaks to the title that Paul or the staff here gave me of the power of empathy, and how Chim managed to have this girl who's clearly troubled address him and say, here's what I can do, here's who I am. And Chim evoked that kind of relationship in children, in adults, and as we'll see, Hollywood stars later. So it was a special skill that he had, And this picture conveys a sort of horror and terror of war. And it's been used as a cover of a dozen or more books on children of war, abnormal development, and other problematic stories of children. A couple of Polish journalists about 6, 7 years ago set out to find out who she was. And there's an hour-long film that tells the story of their pursuit. There were several other Tereshkas they found in the records of various, they knew which home she was in. And finally, they found the right one. She had died many years before. Her brother told the story. She had been wounded by shrapnel to her head from some wartime explosion and was in this clinic and never emerged. And she died, I think, at age 39. So it's a tragic life. She was not Jewish, as sometimes reported, but she was, one of the many children who suffered. And Chim captured this in a way that registers with so many people. It became an important feature when the story was first published in Life magazine. You can see this downstairs in the vitrines, the 7-page article with 11 photos all by Chim, shows Tereshka. And it was December 27th, 1948, when this appeared. And it really registered with me as such a powerful story. And there's so many more images that are shown in the pages there. It was featured as the opening story. It was not the cover, it was a Christmas cover, but the opening story on page 13 begins with the children of Europe and how they're still suffering, or struggling for Christmas. It ended in a very distinctive way, which was not common at the time. It ended with a box which lists 6 charities that readers could donate to. And that was a transformation because it hadn't been the common practice. And so what we see here is Chim is often credited, not the only one, but credited with turning from the photo to the photo story. That Chim saw these things as a sequence of photos and as telling a story more than one image. It wasn't one glorious, fantastically composed image, it was a story. So it went from story, from image to story, to empathy, and to action. The idea of donating money was a fresh notion. And Nadia Baer tells that story also in her book about the decisive network. And so it's really pretty interesting to me how that evolved. And so I'm sort of grateful for that. But there's lots of other ways that Chim inspired people. I get a contact maybe 20 years ago from a German philanthropist who wanted to have the photo and to use the name the Tereshka Foundation for his efforts about the children of war in Rwanda. And so, of course, I agreed to that. And his brochures and website you can take a look at, show Tereshka. Carol Nagar, who's written about Chim, wrote a short novella, a kind of fantasy of how they met, about what happened that produced that photo. It's for sale downstairs, so you can pick up a copy. There's just a few. It's a small production run of that book, so I think you got the last 30 or 40 of them for the store downstairs. And the stories continue about Tereshka. Howard Greenberg donated this somewhat different print. We have the contact sheets, so we see there's about 6 photos that are in the series. And so this one went to the Boston Museum of Fine Art in 2019. Chim continued, his active work as a journalist, a photographer, and here you see some of his press cards, and then began to go to Israel in 1951 and photographed a story. I like this, young woman on the left with a rifle over her shoulder, sort of self-confidence and determination determined look on her face as she goes off to sentry duty. On the right, you have the first child born in the town of Alma, northern Israel. Now, that's a fascinating story that deserves a book. In fact, it's getting a book. So in San Nicandro in Italy, there were a group of Italians, Christians, who converted to Judaism. I think 81, was it, Tom? 81, and moved to Israel as a group. And this was the first child born in that community in Alma, at Chim photograph. And it's such a wonderful, filled with joy of the proud father. And this photo has been used by companies to promote their new products, their pride in their new products. But Tom contributed a wonderful fresh chapter for the book that will be published shortly about San Nicandro and the conversion story. It's a story that UNESCO told, but now it's coming out in book form. Giovanna Hendel is the woman who put this all together. So Chim was very devoted to Israel. And this photo is another one of them. This is a wedding photo with a traditional Jewish chuppah, the wedding cloth above their heads, held up in this case by a pitchfork and a gun. Wonderful. And, I mean, this is a startling photo that Chim just happened to take, yet which led some reviewers to criticize, to say, could not believe that just happened, that Chim was there at that moment. It just could be, it must have been staged. And so this concern about the authority, authenticity of photos is, as you know, a common theme. Robert Capa's The Soldier Dying in Spain is another episode in that way. I don't believe these guys manufactured these photos. I think it was pretty genuine, and this, I think, is, to me, strikes me quite realistic of what happened. There's, in fact, several pictures on the contact sheets from that, so you can see a somewhat different angle. So, in Israel, he began to use color, and that was new for the time, and the publications, the travel magazines were beginning to use color, the high-end ones. The one on the left of this Yemeni steel worker, pride, that was hanging in my bedroom as a child, and I always remember that. I like that one a lot. It just shows us, again, the nobility of labor and the pride that he had. So it wasn't only pain that Chim captured, he captured the pride. On the right, you see another picture from an Independence Day parade. Now, if you look at that, I think probably Tom sees what's wrong with it. There's something wrong in this picture. Look at the Israeli flag. What color is it? It's green. What color should it be? Blue, right, okay. So these early Kodachromes, the dyes have faded over time. And some of them just haven't been rebalanced well. Several people worked on this, including Tom. Philip Brookman, you may know also, he worked on these to try to restore them. But this one didn't get handled by them. I like the picture, I like the line, the composition, and so on, and the story it tells. It's, if you know Tel Aviv, Allenby Street is a main street. Now, this is a sort of early version. But it makes you question also the green, but you'll know also that the colors of the shirts, the people walking, those were probably blue as well, because it was the labor union or labor movement, Hechalutz Hatzair group, that had these blue shirts. And so the trees are green, which that's okay, but we don't quite know all the colors that are there. So he photographed in Israel during that time, but he began to rise up and become the prominent figure who was called on to photograph personalities like Toscanini with the death masks of, I think, Verdi and Mozart, I'm not sure now, and then Bernard Berenson at the Borghese Gallery, a famous one that's on the cover of Tom's book and several of the books that I'll show you in a moment. Now, here we come again on the right, a remarkable picture of Pablo Picasso, 1937 in the Paris in the Paris, in the Spanish pavilion at the Paris World's Fair at that time, in front of a section of Guernica. And what do you see there, looking up to the sky? A woman in anguish. All right? And among the joys I get are the emails that surface every so often from three art historians at the University of British Columbia who write to me and tell me they believe that the picture, that the Guernica was based on Chim's picture. Should I go back to it? There we go. All right? So it's not quite the same, but it's artistic interpretation. But these art historians argue that Picasso must have seen the publication of this picture in the French magazines of the time, Regards, Vue, and others that Chim published many stories in, and that influenced him. And then when Chim came to photograph him, he said, "Would you stand over here?" I mean, this is a 30-foot painting. And there's a woman in anguish looking up to the sky at the far left. This one's on the far right. And so you see here the potential. So my historian friends of Chim, Cynthia Young, Carol Nagar, both say, good hypothesis, but not enough proof. But for the art historians, it was good enough for them to publish a paper in an art history academic journal. So the stories go on, and the connections always fascinate me. Chim went to Venice often. He loved to go there and loved Italy. He photographed many of the religious festivals and rituals around, up and down the coast. He traveled with Carlo Levi to the south to photograph the poverty and the illiteracy in the southern Puglia region. And he photographed Peggy Guggenheim. And it's a great photo, which the Guggenheim Museum and other places show. I mean, here's Peggy at her place. Some of you may have been to Venice to see her art gallery. It's quite a striking place, right on the Grand Canal. And there's Peggy in all her glory and her garish glasses looking out. So I think that's, it's a pretty great picture, which got a lot of visibility through the Guggenheim Museum. And one day I get a call from Magnum, from Diane, who's the licensing person there. And she says, Ben, need your help here. There's going to be a one-woman play on Broadway about Peggy Guggenheim, and they want to use your uncle's picture. I said, great. It's going to be on every bus, and it's going to be everywhere. I said, wonderful. I said, why are you calling me? I mean, this is normal stuff. I didn't say. She said, well, there's a problem. They'd like to colorize your uncle's photograph. Now, the artist, I forgot his name, but Frank, I forgot. But he was famous. I knew his work. When she mentioned it, I knew instantly. And he had done a lot of work for the New York Times, colorizing famous black and white photos. And I sort of laughed a minute, and I said, yeah, that's wonderful. That's great, I'm happy to have that, as long as, there's an explanation and there's a link to the website and that tells the story. Yeah, I'm good with that. And I wait a minute, she's still there, and she says to me, there's something else. They want to replace the face of Peggy Guggenheim with the face of Mercedes Ruehl, the actress. So I laughed, and I said, okay, well, I have a request, 4 tickets for opening night. And so that's what it looks like. That was the poster that was on the bus stops and on the buses. And there I am. And we got to talk to Mercedes Ruehl and so on. So you can see they've lifted the glasses above her head. They show Mercedes Ruehl. The dogs are now pink. It's quite a story. But I like these stories. I love the way that Chim's work or other photographers get picked up, interpreted. Now, you should know Magnum has a strict no cropping, no any alteration to photos. So she would have had to call me. I get a call or an email when they want to use a photo for a book cover, and they just want to put the title across the top. Even that requires my approval, but I'm happy to do that, so that's kind of part of what my job is. But this was a fun story, which had a nice outcome. There's many other stories. Sophia Loren, these famous pictures are, he began to work photographing Hollywood actresses and Italian actresses. Gina Lollobrigida, we'll see in a while. But here was very young Sophia Loren in this fetching way, and just in the hallway by a kitchen in her apartment. The story goes that when Chim arrived, she was in a negligee, and she had to go change, and then she had to coach him how to do this kind of cheesecake pictures, which result in this one. Maybe color rebalanced a little too much on the red, but a striking image, and her narrow waistline emphasized by the negative space triangle, under her arm there. So, but I think no Hollywood agent would today allow such a picture to be taken in this kind of informal, way, in just in the kitchen area of her apartment. He photographed Ingrid Bergman many times. She was eager to have him photograph her. There's a letter, you can see it on the website. It says, "I make beautiful babies, you make beautiful photos." And she always wanted him to come photograph her children. And so there was a long continuing relationship in a nice way, and these are her and her children. There's also Joan Collins. Apparently, Joan Collins thinks this is her favorite picture of herself, of all the portraits done of her. And Kirk Douglas over here. There were others. Audrey Hepburn, an enduring favorite, gets reproduced, for calendars and other stories about this legendary, I guess she was a Dutch actress who became a Hollywood star, funny face, and I guess Breakfast at Tiffany may be known to you. Others, not quite Hollywood, but Maria Callas, the one on the right, was used for a postage stamp. So there's all kinds of ways these photos emerge and become, used in public ways. As Gina Lollobrigida, and then on the right is a picture of Chim with Marilyn Monroe, right, at the 21 Club in New York. So that's kind of the circles he traveled in. And that is me. In the months before he was killed, he photographed me with my sister and my mother on 93rd Street on West End Avenue, where we lived in New York, by the Joan of Arc monument. So I have that memory, and that's where it goes. He was this kind uncle who brought me toys and books and gifts, and my sister knew him better and had more stories to tell of him. And so I'm still very close with my sister. She works with me on these things as well, although she's struggling at age 88 in Tel Aviv these days, so it's not an easy place to be. But she no longer runs to the bomb shelters when the sirens blare, and so that's the sort of, and I talk to her most days, so there we are. Life goes on in very different ways. The last pictures at the Suez Canal, there's many stories about these. Let's see, how are we doing on time? I think I'm going to move on. But these were two of the British paratroopers who were, and they were the last to see Chim, and in the 20 minutes before he was killed. So he was traveling with a French photographer named Jean Roy for Paris Match, and they were going, it was 4 days after the armistice, so it should have been okay. They were going to sign for a prisoner exchange, and whatever happened, we don't exactly know, but Egyptian machine gunners killed them both, and their Jeep falls into the Sweetwater Canal. And it was a tragedy that my mother heard about the death of her brother on the morning news. So, and that was a memorable day for me as a 9-year-old kid. And here you see the American flag over the casket and the French flag over the other one, with a rabbi from the U.S. Army at the field service in 1956. He was just short of 45 at that time. So I just move on. Well, maybe I should take a breath and say, any questions or comments about this life story? Yes, thank you. Oh, I'm sorry. Let's wait for the microphone. Sorry to jump on the staff. Surprise. let me take a break and we'll just see what people say. Yeah?
Sounds good. All right.
There was a question right in the center there. You want to?
Okay, so hold up 1 second. We'll get the microphone to you.
Just a simple question. I'm just curious if you could fill in very briefly how he got from Paris in the 1930s to America.
Okay, that's a fair question, right. He was not in Paris, but in Spain. And he boarded the ship, the SS Sinaya, which was taking refugees. By 1930, late 30, maybe 38, the sad story of the Republican defeat was emerging, and tens of thousands, I think 120,000 refugees went from Spain to Mexico, the only place that took them, welcomed them. And to this day, there's a strong, Spanish community in Mexico that has their basketball and football teams, and they have newspapers, and there's a whole, surviving community. So he rode that boat with them. He spent a few months around Mexico photographing harvests and farmers, and then went to El Paso and got on a train and came to New York, and then was in New York. And as I say, during the war, he was in the U.S. Army and became a U.S. citizen and was a Ritchie boy, so he had his service that way. Thank you. Thank you. Other
Next
questions?
question, right here.
Just clarification about the life history story?
Hi, good evening. I wanted to ask you, was he ever in Guernica?
Was he what?
In Guernica. That
Was he in Guernica?
Yeah, because that photograph he has of the lady and
nursing
the...
lady? No, that
no?
was Estremadura.
It was Extremadura, okay.
Yeah, I don't know if he was in Guernica. That's a good question.
Oh, the reason I
Cynthia Young's book has tracks where he went on each day, and there's a map that shows you all the places he went to. And there's a continuing interest. There's a French researcher, Julio Mouton, I guess he's Spanish, but he's in Paris, Julio Mouton, who's made an online map of Spain that shows a dot for every picture that Chim and Kappa took. And you can zoom in on it and click on it, and you'll see the picture.
No, the reason I ask you is because the lady, the square she's standing in looks a lot like the schoolyard in Guernica.
No, it's Estremadura. I think that's pretty well documented. So, yeah. Anybody else question about the history or particular photos? Okay, you can think about them, come back to it, but let me get on with the talk, which is focusing on, the second half is here, what's happened, how the stories that he told became legends and how they grew in importance. So Chim did a book with Anne Carnahan about the Vatican. He was enchanted by the rituals of the Catholic rituals around Spain, and he did a whole book about photographs of the Vatican. This early book shows one of those rituals, a snake festival somewhere in Italy. There's hundreds of pictures where these two children, these like 2-year-olds, less than 2 years old, with calmly playing with a snake. And this ritual goes on every year, so it's commonplace for this to happen here. But it's rather a startling picture there. I think it always stuns me. There are two of the books. Inga Bondi, one of the heroic figures of Magnum, who was one of the staffers and worked. She lived to age 99. She died just a couple of years ago, but she was a wonderful storyteller. And so she wrote the book in 1996, Coffee Table Book. And Tom Beck wrote this 2004 book. But I love the book. It's a strict format of some few thousand words up front as an introduction, and then 55 pictures. But Tom's captions are exceptional. Nobody else who writes and describes the picture, making points about their composition, their photographic nature, and also making points about the historical context. This book was a good seller. I think 20,000 copies were printed. If you find a copy online in the used bookstores, you should get it. It's become a kind of rare book, but it's really a very nice one to have there. There were many other books, a variety of them. The We Went Back exhibit, Cynthia Young, so on. This one on the lower left is important, Carol Nagar's book, but that image was often credited to Robert Capa. And Cynthia Young has now gone back through using the Mexican suitcase files to reattribute about 7 or 8 of the famous pictures that were in the books about Robert Capa, and they were Chim's pictures as well. There's a great deal of interest in Capa and Gerda Taro. Gerda Taro's a beneficiary of the movement to bring forward the histories of women photographers, and she's reported as being the first woman to die as a war photographer. So these were some of them. On the lower right, you see the picture. If you notice, the hand is an elderly man's hand writing the letter A. It was adult illiteracy campaign that UNESCO launched that Chim covered in this trip with Carlo Levi. It's sort of a play on the book that Christ stopped at Eboli. Whoops, sorry. Eboli is a southern city in Italy, and so it's suggested that the life is so poor and difficult in the southern part that Christ did not get past Eboli. But they did not stop at Eboli, and so they tell the story of these communities there. Carol's book is the best biography. I mean, wonderfully researched, poetically written. Unfortunately, priced too high. It's over $100 price for the book, but you may be able to find copies on it. But it's an excellent book done recently that tells the story about it. I mentioned here, there's another tribute that was put up in 2018 about Robert Capa, Gerda Taro, and Chim worked in this studio, and that's where they did their photography, and it's from there that the Mexican suitcase was sent out in 1938. Many exhibits went on. ICP did exhibits, the Mexican suitcase, that's the box that the negatives came in. And then the picture, we went back with this early, again, color portrait from the beaches of Normandy. This destroyed, I guess it was a cannon emplacement that was displaced after the war, but the children happily playing beneath it was sort of a symbol. This was the cover of This Week magazine, was the widely published Sunday supplement for newspapers all around North America, and it got the front page story that way. They did a funny thing because they flipped it. They flipped the image because their graphic design favored it going the other way. There was a nice exhibit in Tel Aviv. My sister and I both spoke there, and it was a kind of beautifully installed with new color photos found during that development of that exhibit in Magnum, New York. We found about 100 color slides that were never been published. So they were quickly snapped up by the Israeli curator who made large prints of these color. There he is, Asaf Galai, filmmaker as well. He just has a new film out now. And then, it continues. I mean, there are many other exhibits, but I feature this, the exhibit, Chim's Photojournalism from War to Hope, was in Illinois for about a year, and then went to Oregon and Vancouver, and now I'm looking for places. There are other places I'm talking with about putting that exhibit up. Other exhibits, there was a very nice exhibit in Venice in 24. And then there is now coming in May, there'll be a new exhibit and a permanent one in Menorca Historical Society. Chim traveled, sorry, I keep hitting it, but Chim traveled to Menorca during his stay. It's the island off the coast of Barcelona. And so they're collecting all these, and we have 21 prints that, I've donated a lot of work to the Library of Congress in the US, but they're making the scans available for this exhibit and for the printing. And the French National Archives will have an exhibit of Chim and Capa in Spain for 2027. So the stories go on. And of course here I'm just delighted and filled with joy and satisfaction that on September 10th, this exhibit opened here. And remains on view and has been seen by almost 10,000 people, and so it's the way the stories get told. And thanks to Paul and the other staff here who have made this happen. There's a nice video the group did here. You can take a look. It includes me as well as Gail Morell telling the story about this exhibit. And other things, my efforts at donating. ICP has a large collection of materials, and I began donating to the Library of Congress in 2013, and they have now more than 1,000 scanned images on their website that you can see and take a look at. Whoops, so that's that site. And there's the website that I've created and, filled out over the years, which has all the information that I can collect and all the writings about Chim. And there's an archive with 600 scanned of his documents and letters and photos from his work, which have also now gone to the Library of Congress. So, I have a community of people who help me with these things, and so I'm pleased that that goes forward. And, Wikipedia is out there too, so if you want to read it, you can read that, or you can edit it and add something to it that you find worthwhile if you like. And that's my story of my dear Uncle Chim. Thank you for your attention. And now we can have questions.
Yeah. So we're, of course, going to open up again for questions, but I'd like to ask the first one.
Okay.
Because one of the things that I thought about watching your talk is the subtext of it, which is how utterly indefatigable Ben Shneiderman has been in promoting his uncle's work. And I want to ask a question about that, but I'll start with an anecdote, which, as I mentioned, Tom Beck is here. Tom did this book for Phaidon in the, 2004 is when the book came out. And right around that time, we did an exhibition at the Corcoran Gallery of Art, which meant that I already knew Tom because Tom was teaching photo history at the Corcoran Gallery of Art, Corcoran College of Art and Design, where I work. But I assisted Tom on some of the logistics for that project. And what that meant was that I was in touch with Ben quite a bit. And Ben lived very nearby. Ben lived, I'm trying to remember, is it Tacoma? No, not Tacoma Park. In Bethesda?
At that time, we lived in Washington, D.C.
Oh, right inside the border.
Connecticut Avenue.
Yeah. And one of the things that I want to tell you about Ben is that Ben is not shy about asking for what he wants. And you deal with lots of people in my business, but very few of them are effective at getting what they want. Mostly they just annoy you, right? And there's this contest that you go into willingly if you're a curator, which is that that in order to do your job, you're going to work with other people. And it's always very helpful to remember that other people have their own motives, have their own goals, their own interests that they're trying to satisfy. But for whatever reason, most photographers that I've worked with, most family members of those photographers are not very good at getting what they want. And Ben is very good at getting what he wants. And I was very impressed dealing with Ben all the way through that entire process. And so I was delighted when a few years ago, Ben contacted me and said, I want to re-engage with you about my uncle. And I think you told me at the time that you were establishing a new home in Canada, in Vancouver specifically, and that you felt that there was not enough representation of your uncle's work in Canada, and would I be interested? Now, one of the things that is also interesting about Ben is that he's very generous. He always has been, right? He's trying to spread his uncle's work around, but he's also very generous in accomplishing that. And you just heard a great story that I had not heard about that, like your generosity with that image of Peggy Guggenheim. Most photographers in the States would never in a million years let that happen. But look how wonderful the result was, just because your mind is open and you have this goal in mind, which is getting your uncle's work out into the world again and again and again. So the question that I want to ask, because I know that there is no school that teaches you how to be the steward of the legacy of a photographer. There is no such thing. And yet you are very good at it, and you've been doing it for quite a while. Yeah. But you didn't tell us the story of how you got started and how you learned how to do it. Did you learn by doing? Was it your mother that you watched doing it?
Yeah.
How did
I
that
guess a
happen?
nice way to start the response. Thank you for that. And yes, I mean, I do remember 5 years ago, we had this discussion, and you were interested in this UNESCO project, and so you came over, and we sorted through from the prints I had, which were quite a few at the time, and we chose the set which I donated to, the Image Center. So that's the basis. So that's, but it was based on the trust that we had from a long time ago. So you might go back to when I was a high school student, and I began to work for Cornell Kappa and Edie Kappa on at their home on Fifth Avenue and 29th Street or so. And I was involved with Cornell in arranging Robert Kappa's archives. So that was his younger brother, who had been killed in 1954 in Vietnam. Actually, I was in Vietnam last month, and in the War Museum is a whole panel about Robert Capa and 4 of his pictures and a picture of Robert Capa. Anyway, so I was engaged that way. And at the time, I was wanting to be a photographer. During college years, I was the photo editor for the City College of New York yearbook, and I carried my camera every day taking pictures in Chim-like style of the activities at City College. And Cornell actually talked me out of it. Here I had the opportunity and the connection with Magnum, and Cornell said, no, you don't want to do that. It's just a very difficult life, There's only room for 1,000 photographers in the world. It's very competitive, very nasty. You're always traveling. You don't have a family life. You don't want to do that. So I kept photography as my hobby, which I've continued to do. And I've photographed at professional conferences, and I have a well-curated collection of 40,000 photos of mine, which there's a few online exhibits at the Computer History Museum, the Charles Babbage Institute, about the people in my field and how that works. So I went from there, and I was always following my mother, who was struggling to decide what to do. Cornell was a wonderful supportive force in helping us, with that and arranging. We would donate every year or so a new set of pictures to the ICP. So that became the dominant destination. But along the way, there were other opportunities, and I became the advocate. There's two schools of thought for the photo estates. One is put it all in one place. Yale Museum, okay? Or the Beinecke, one museum where the scholars can come and see everything. And I took the other approach, which is, no, I don't believe that any one place is a durable, reliable source. And when there were invitations, like George Eastman House did an exhibit, I donated some pictures. De Young Museum in San Francisco did an exhibit. I donated 70 pictures to them. Victoria and Albert in London. So one by one, these places got collections. And so I try on the website to list the places where I know that there are ample collections. So that's one. I would say another interesting, your question is reasonable. Among Magnum, remember I said there's 85 photographers, but about 20% of Magnum's income, 15 to 20%, is from those estates. And so there's a separate estates group of those who are managers of the estates of these other photographers who meet by phone and Zoom and talk about the strategies. And we have very different strategies. So Paul Fusco's daughter, Marina, she's collected all the images and the negatives. She's got them under her control. But that's a big job. And I just sort of farmed it out to different places. So the negatives are largely in Magnum, New York, but recently moved to New Jersey in a storage facility on cold storage. So, and every so often, the darkroom printer gets instructions to go to the cold storage and find this negative, which is pretty well indexed, and Magnum's Cortex database helps find the things they want and makes a fresh print in the traditional ways, or a digital scan. Magnum's business now works by digital scans, about 1.5 million photos on their database, and that's how they work out of New York, London, and Paris. I have a distributed approach, and I've given it to Library of Congress as well. Paris Magnum has also some resources, and there's still evolving issues. Magnum Paris collected what they call the analog archive. They collected as many, it's about 400,000 pictures by Magnum photographers, and their hope is that it gets donated. I mean, it requires a wealthy donor that winds up at the Centre Pompidou. So that we're still waiting to see that happen. But that would be a major change, because there are many in France who would like to claim Magnum's cultural, contributions to be French. And in many ways, they have a good argument. And that would secure that. No, Jane's saying she's not sure. So you could see it as a New York-based and somewhat London. So anyway, that's a brief answer. There's many approaches to it, and we do discuss that so there's 15 or 20 estates of the Magnum Circle.
I think that,
that was more than you want to know.
No, that's all right. The proof of how successful it is all these books, all these exhibitions that have happened over many years. Because Ben's uncle passed away in 1956, it's just as possible that there's very little awareness of his work today. Yeah. But as you can tell from this talk, Ben doesn't stop, and therefore the work has gotten out and has found an audience. I saw both of those shows at ICP. Mm-hmm. I remember going to New York specifically to see those shows at ICP. So that's just one of the many, many things that he's done. Anyway, thanks for answering that question. I appreciate it.
Audience questions.
Yeah. All the way back there, if we can get the microphone back there.
As a volunteer here as a docent.
Is that Miriam?
Yes, it is.
All right.
Hi there. I've spent lots of time in this exhibition talking about it and reading all about David Seymour, et cetera, et cetera. So I've taken sort of a personal interest in it all. So when I was reading a book a couple of weeks ago by a significant historian at Princeton, and in his book, he has reproduced Tereshka with no attribution. My question, and I felt so badly about it that I actually sent an email to this guy and said, I'm reading your interesting book, but my goodness, this is not an attributed image. And I told him a thing or two or three or four about David Seymour. And within 24 hours, this guy writes me back, and he said, at the time, I didn't attribute it. I didn't know. But when the book first came out in 2006, somebody drew it to my attention, and I right away got in touch with Magnum, and I paid the appropriate fee and made it all right. So my question, to get to my question, is, how do you police the use of these images?
It's a reasonable question. And, Magnum does have people doing that and lawyers to pursue it. So, one case that I knew, I saw a picture of Chim's in the Washington Post one day, it's a while ago, and I just contacted the Magnum people, who sent a note to the Washington Post that said, hey, this is one of ours, and they paid whatever, $100 or so. So those things do get sort of, look, there's high school students in China who are using these pictures for that's fine with me. But, when a publication like Washington Post, New York Times, or television stations, most of them are pretty responsible, and they will do the right thing. So I do get to hear it. I do get to see. There's a certain income, modest, a few $1,000s a year from the Chim account, that, and I see the catalog of who's licensing it for what, or what exhibits it was in, or a collector who buys a print. Magnum also sells modern prints of these. You can get these images from them. It's not cheap, but you can get them from them. Magnum does have this nice square print sales twice a year, and I include Chim's work in that every time. It's been going 10 years now, very successful. And for $100 or $110, you get a small 6x6-inch print with a caption that I've written about Chim's work, but you know, every Magnum photographer gets the chance to submit a photo to that. So those are the kind of chores I do. And I think, you know, again, my job is to preserve and promote, but I have, you know, worked it through as an exit strategy to donate to these different institutions and make sure that other people take this on. I don't want to be the one who does it. I want to facilitate those who, the Carol Nagars, the Cynthia Youngs, the Paul Roths, who actually do the work. And so those professionals are the ones I want to see going. So I think that's the strategy I've adopted. And I've donated, you know, quite a lot of things. As I've moved to Canada, I donated to the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C., where Adam Sylvia, a wonderful young historian who the prints and photographs section of the Library of Congress has 60 full-time professionals. I mean, it's an unusual place. It doesn't put on exhibits, but they do a great job of preservation and supporting researchers who come there. And so I have a long history. I've worked on my other professional side with Library of Congress, and so that was pretty good. So anyway, I think that's, you know, there is a team that goes about doing it, and the responsible parties generally, you know, are not a problem. Okay, it's fine. I mean, look, I'm pleased when it gets out there. Of course, I do want it to be credited, and I'm the one always, whenever Magnum calls me, I say, and please have them include the website, www.davidseymour.com. So I, you know, have to say that. And the other, yeah, so I still want to, looking at Tom, I just want to know if you have any comments. You're you know, an important figure in this story. Would you? What did you think of, what did I leave out of this talk?
I learned a lot from your talk about your relationship with your uncle that I didn't know before. About rights, there's the Internet Archive, which so many books get put in there. One of mine got put in there. And I thought, what the heck? More people might see it. I think you take the attitude that you do. But of course, there's the pictures on the covers of these books. And those have rights to them, but Internet Archive hasn't paid those rights. So it's another one that has gotten away. But one could be really litigious about it, but I don't have the time to do that, and I'm sure you don't either.
Yeah, I'm a particular admirer of the Internet Archive, run by Brewster Kahle. I wouldn't say a close colleague, but a colleague and someone I know who's done this remarkable job of archiving the whole internet, everything that's out there. And then he went on to do the books. So he does respect the rights, you know, holders, and there's various ways they've tried to make accommodations that fit it. So I think I'm generally very strong in defending him. Yeah. So is anything about the content here that you want to add, or stories that you feel should be told?
Well, interesting about that rule image for Broadway. The colorizing of it struck me as rather fascinating, because I've seen a number of 19th century Italian photographs which have been hand-painted, and that has the colors of those exact kinds of colors they used on those photographs.
It was the style of this photographer. Maybe it's on that image, but we could dig it out somewhere. But he did that kind of funny colorized tones. American Civil War photographs, you know, or daguerreotypes. They have, you know, a little bit pink on the faces, or lipstick red, and so on. Yeah. All right. Well, thank you.
The artifice is apparent, which makes it much more acceptable. So we have somebody over here who raised her hand before, back there. Let's go to her first, and then we'll get to the others. I think we have time for a couple more questions after this one.
Hi, thank you. That was really fascinating. It was my first introduction to Chim. I'm wondering about you as the steward of your uncle's estate, and maybe other people in the room who are thinking about the future of image in the world of AI, which I think is an interesting intersection of your work. How do you see that in the future? You've been obviously very generous. But.
I would enthusiastically refer you to Fred Richen's book of last year called The Synthetic Eye. The Synthetic Eye. Very, very thoughtful overview of these things. Fred Richin is married to Carol Nagar, so there's, these combinations, but he's very good about that. So yes, AI challenges the authority of pictures. If you see it, you can believe it, was what they used to believe, that photos were true, but they were never true. Back even Edward Curtis, who photographed the American Indians, would manipulate the photos, would bring artifacts from one tribe and put them with another tribe, bring clothes or headdresses. And so photography has always been used in a manipulative way. Stalin removed the face of one of his now out of favor staff, and those kind of things have happened over the years. So yeah, it's a real challenge. There's a fundamental challenge to photography, and the Magnum people are struggling because the iPhone has turned, it used to be only 10 or 15% of the population could reliably make a good picture, and you could get a job as a photographer. But now, everybody's got this, and it does a pretty good job of making a good picture. So in democratizing the access to quality images, we've now weakened the case for the Magnum community and the high-end photographers who want $2,500 a day. When, the person at the street in Tehran can get the cover picture on the New York Times. That's a pretty big change in the way things go. So, we have to see. I mean, Magnum is struggling, as it has for all its years, but getting ready to celebrate its 80th birthday. So it's pretty amazing that that's gone that far. Okay, 2 other questions?
Yeah, we've got a couple other questions here.
Here?
Send the microphone down there, and then after that, we'll send it over here.
Thank you. In your presentation, which was fascinating, there was an image of a plaque commemorating the residents of Terro Kappa and Chim in Paris. I was wondering if you knew the address where that plaque was located.
Yeah, sure. I mean, you can find, I don't have it now. It doesn't say there, does it? But you can, if you search on that, you'll get the address, so you can go see it.
I'd love to walk around Paris and look at the plaques.
Yeah, there's lots of plaques around Paris. They're very sensitive to history.
If you run out of plaques, there are always cemeteries.
You see one there's a plaque near my cousin's home in Paris where Neptune Nessifor did the first photograph, or reputedly did that.
Thank you.
So yeah, it's.
Hey, we have time for a couple more questions. One over here.
Thank you, Ben. That was really engaging storytelling presentation of images, the stories to tell. A couple of things I may ask. With the Tolman, if I heard Paul correctly, I'm not sure if the Image Center came up with the power of empathy.
Yeah.
And I would like to explore that a little bit. I think Paul did that with the generosity, which could be a similar word. I think that's evident in your stories. Do you have a story maybe about your own personal experiences as a young boy of what you felt was your uncle's empathy? And seeing the exhibit downstairs, which I recommend to people here, you do get that sense of some of the images there of the young people in particular can be quite marking in what my response is there. And maybe my little exploration of the empathy, Paul, again, talking about your background dealing with the interface with computers. Do you sense the power of empathy that photographs can have to what it is to be human, to humans interacting with computers?
Reaching around back. Thank you. I guess there's long answers to all that, but I knew my uncle as a warm uncle, and he was kind and gentle and would get down on the floor and play with me and brought me books and toys. So that was what I saw. My sister tells other stories about how he taught her what kind of cashmere sweaters to wear and what kind of drinks a young lady should be asking in a bar. And so he was always well-dressed and, liked his food. Stayed at the Hotel Daniele in Venice, where I stayed a few years ago, just to follow the footsteps. And so he had all that world, but he also had the capacity to reach to individuals. How did he get that? I don't know. How do I get my empathy? These are difficult questions to answer, but I think the role model of others, I see the work my parents did as journalists was also filled with empathy and the stories they told in the Spanish Civil War. A recently republished book of my father's from 1938 tells these troubling stories about how people, individuals, lived. And my father in 1938 went to Africa and was the editor of a newspaper there. And his stories about Africa are now there's a woman writing a book about his Africa. There's about 50 articles they've found. And so it's, my parents told these stories. And then, of course, the Holocaust stories. And I became involved. I was for the Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C., I designed the use of computers. I wrote a 300-page report about the use of computers in public-facing spaces for curatorial and archival purposes, for administrative purposes, and for all the uses. So I had a close involvement. So the need to tell these stories is pretty strong with me. And, my uncle was a model, my parents were a model, and it just felt like there was work to be done. That was, caring for the world. I would say, my interest in human-computer interaction and user interface is also designed around the idea of democratizing access, enabling those users with disabilities, older adults, children to have access. Those are parts of the stories that now are being told about. My family, my uncle told stories with pictures, my parents told stories with words, and I tell stories with data. So it's kind of a nice little family story of that's being told right now. So, I like those kind of things, but I don't know. Do you have something else in mind of in your question?
No, I like the way the way you explored that,
Yeah.
in that you see the relationship, your own personal, and your outreach, particularly with that museum in Washington, D.C., which I've been to once before. You see stories being recorded by survivors who are no longer going to be with us, using technology that way. And I think that I really like that connection, because like everything, things can be good, but you can choose it to be bad. You can misuse the camera too. In fairness, you can blackmail someone with some scandalous photo.
Yes.
So I like your story. Thank you.
Yeah, Churchill said, history will be kind to me. I will write it. So yes, telling the right stories is pretty important.
So we have time for one more question. There was a gentleman back there. If you can take the microphone up there.
Thank you. I had a quick question. Something that I struggle with myself. So last week I went home to India, where I'm from, and some of the places where my family is from, in very simple, kind of poverty-stricken environments, and doing the things that I've found natural, which is just photographing and documenting those environments. And so today's talk was really good. But the question I had is, being in these places, often as your uncle was, poverty-stricken, war-stricken places, refugee camps, and so on and so forth. As a photographer, you're in these environments, you take the photo, you publish it, but you move on. Whereas the people that are in the photo and in those environments, their circumstances stay the same, and those subjects stay in those same places. It's something that I struggle with myself quite a bit, but I'm wondering what your thoughts on that are.
Yes,
especially with that relationship with the photographer and the subject, and what their responsibility is if they have one to that subject.
It is a recurring theme in the Magnum discussions, because these Magnum photographers, as you say, fly in, photograph some horrific story, and they're gone. And that is a real dilemma. They can get out, and what does one say to that? So there are a changing set of ethical issues. For example, also the anthropology community faces this. My daughter, an anthropologist, is, the idea of anthropologists coming to a village and writing the story is no longer acceptable. And my daughter, for example, will write about the places she works in Nepal and India, and only co-authored with people who are local. So that's one way to cope with it. Magnum has strived to bring in photographers very diverse from different locations and different parts of the world, and also women. Magnum is often criticized because it was largely men, a few famous women, Eve Arnold and Inga Morath and so on, Marilyn Silverstone. So there were some, but they were always, they felt challenged, let's say. It wasn't easy. So they've done more to bring those diverse and, global South. So Magnum's faced many challenges, and its male culture also was challenged various times for the bad things some of the photographers did. And we don't need to tell the stories, but, Magnum's an imperfect human community of 85 people who don't always do the right thing. I would say, maybe I'll leave you with one uplifting thought. In the aftermath of my donating prints to the U.S. National Gallery of Art in Washington, Mark Levitch, a historian, wrote a wonderful, my favorite piece, David Seymour, a humanist photographer. And for 20 years it was on the NGA's website, and in their reorganization and new software, they took it down, and I've not been able to get them put it back up. So you have to go, actually the Internet Archive has it. The Wayback Machine, I did get it, I got it back, and I've reconstructed that article, but it's it reminds me, when I read that, and I read it every few years, to remind me of what it was that he did that made it a humanist effort, that was empathy engaged. So I leave you with that, People matter in the world of technology, in the world I work on. People, I'm still a great believer in the power of people, and I hope you will be too. Thank you.
Thank you. All right. Thank you so much, Ben. I just want to remind all of you that our exhibitions, Magnum's First and Chim's Children of Europe, are on view through April 4th. We have one last public exhibition tour of the season, led by the curator of Chim's Children of Europe, Gael Morel, and that is on Wednesday, March 25th from 6 to 7 p.m. Please come back for that. Thank you all for attending tonight.
That's good.